I believed it was just my mom's birthday until my son locked the car and said this. We had spent the afternoon polishing small, ordinary rituals into something like celebration, helium balloons bobbing against a low summer ceiling, a buffet of dishes that tasted like other people's summers, a string quartet pretending to be a big band because Mom always liked the old sound. Dorothy Wilson, Mom, sat at the head table in a pink dress that still caught the light the way it used to, even at 85. She kept smoothing her napkin like it could iron out the wrinkles in conversation. I moved through the room in the way children of large families do, smiling when required, smooth with the little lies that keep parties from splintering into confessions. My sister Linda was there, smiling, a practiced closeness on her face. Paul, Linda's partner, hovered by people he wanted to impress and people he didn't want to be noticed by. My son Jason, who is 27, and not by any stretch of the word subtle, stood by the doorway with his phone low in his hand. He kept glancing at me like we shared a private channel. That private channel had been open between us for weeks. The moment was small and sharp. Jason leaned towards me in the car outside the community center, his voice a raw thing. "Get your bag," he said. "We're leaving. Act like nothing's wrong." His hand moved to the lock and clicked it. A sound I didn't know could feel like an altar falling into place. He turned the phone, hit play, and for the first time, the party sounds, the distant clink of glass, laughter, the quartet, shrunk to a soundtrack I didn't belong to anymore. The recording began with Linda's voice. It was chilling, not because she was loud, but because she spoke like something practical that needed doing. "Make sure she signs," Linda was saying. "Power of attorney. She gets sleepy after tea. Paul will bring it. Have the pens ready. We can't leave it to chance." There was a pause, an impatient little rustle. A man's voice, Paul, I knew it without seeing, answered. "I'll handle the tea. Doctor's orders, a little calming, she'll sleep. Once she's in, we get the signatures, move the papers, take the house. It's just paperwork if you know how to make it look right." The laugh that followed on the tape wasn't light. It had that slick, choked thing of collusion. My throat closed. For a second I couldn't tell if the world had tilted or if I'd been standing on a slope for a long time and simply hadn't noticed. The room, the people, the music, everything was the same. And then this voice from my son's phone made it not the same at all. Jason's jaw was set. "She sounds so casual," he said, "like it's a to-do list." I remember the antic gasps from ladies across the hall, the way a chair scraped and someone remarked about the cake. The whole party was happening like a film that I couldn't quite find my seat for. I had been telling myself for months that Linda was doing her best, that her insisting on helping with Mom's finances was that familiar mix of wanting control and wanting to be needed. People help their mothers. People manage things. Families arrange caretaking the way people arrange pictures on a wall. That thought kept me fumbling for equilibrium. I wanted it to be true. Jason's fingers tightened on the phone. He did not shout. He did what he always does. He arranged facts. "Call 911, he said. I could feel a dozen small, shameful reasons to say no. We were at a celebration. We would ruin everything. Mom would be humiliated. But the thing playing through the phone was not humiliation. It was a plan. It was not a petty betrayal. It was methodical, spoken out loud between two people who had been rehearsing a path someone else would have to step into later. I called. My voice vibrated. I remember thinking how thin it sounded, like something that could be easily smudged into meaninglessness. The dispatcher asked the usual questions. She asked where we were, what had happened. Jason held the phone while I spoke. When I handed it back, he slid carefully into a quieter rhythm of command and vulnerability that I recognized as the only thing he ever offered under pressure. "Do not intervene. the dispatcher said. It was a phrase that landed harder on us than any threat could have. We're dispatching officers to observe. They will advise. Keep yourselves safe. 2 words that would rest on our chests for weeks. Do not intervene. You learn a lot in a single heartbeat about who you are. I learned that I could be very calm and very undone at the same time. I learned that my hands can shake and steady themselves. I learned that Jason had anticipated this long before I had let myself think of it as a possibility. He had been patient. He had been collecting small things, emails, receipts, odd handwritten notes that finally, in the car, fit together like teeth into a jaw. We weren't supposed to be heroes. The dispatcher told us not to be. The police did not want civilians confronting suspects. That was their word, their job. Still, there was a moment in the car where I looked at Mom through the windshield and had to decide whether to tell her everything. She was laughing at a line someone had said across the hall. She looked, in that split second, like the person who had braided my hair in 3rd grade and ironed my uniforms and made pasta in 8-pound batches for every neighborhood potluck. She looked like anyone's hero. What do I say? I whispered. Say something small, Jason said. Tell her you saw a friend from Bridge. Offer to get her water. Don't give Linda the look. Don't... And then he stopped. A mother's expression across a table can break a smaller plan than a squad car. He meant. We stayed. We walked back inside with the smiles that sell normalcy. My hands, under my napkin, found the cool paper of the program and folded it into nothing. We moved toward Mom in a circle that felt safe, simply because everyone else thought it was. When we re-entered the room, there was no immediate sign that the recording had changed anything. That was the most dangerous part of all. Life carrying on, as if the conspiracy were a storm we could hide from by simply tugging the curtain shut. Linda's laugh came like a practiced tide. She moved as if she had always been imagining being warm and necessary. People greeted Mom. Someone clinked a fork against a glass and made a joke about the aging disco revival. Officer Martinez was there, 3 tables away, civilian clothes but with a way of being that made silence into an authority. He had told us over the phone that they would set up observation, that we were to act normal, that they would make a move if they saw anyone attempt to take my mother out of the building. We don't want scenes, he had said. I kept thinking of how his voice had trembled just slightly on the last word. No scene that they couldn't control. Linda sat next to Mom for a while, and when she wasn't talking, she held Mom's hand like she was threading a needle. The tea scene happened almost exactly as it had been outlined on my son's phone. Linda excused herself to the kitchen and returned with a small thermos-like carafe. Dr. Peterson, an affable man in his 50s, and the sort of physician Mom trusted because he remembered her name, had been brought in by way of making sure the meds were in order. His hand brushed Mom's shoulder in a way that could have been tenderness. He poured tea. My chest tightened when the cup reached Mom's lips. The soft steam lifted like a specter between us. I felt like I was watching a lover's betrayal, sublime, slow, and intimate. Before the cup touched Mom's mouth, Jason moved. He didn't make a scene. He took the cup from Dr. Peterson's hand as if it had been offered to him. The quartet's strings swelled to cover the moment like a crowd noise, and no one else made it sound like anything. Jason touched the rim, inhaled, and handed the cup back. "It's a little too sweet," he said brightly. "She likes a lighter blend." Linda's smile faltered. Dr. Peterson's eyes flicked away, as if he had suddenly remembered an appointment. I could feel, physically, the air in the room tighten like someone's fingers on a sheet. Paul, who had been keeping himself at the edge of conversations, as if biding time until the party could be assessed and used, lifted his head. "Is everything okay?" someone asked. and the voice was thin with the polite worry that belongs to strangers in a room that expects civility. "Fine," I said, and it sounded like a lie that would become a truth if said enough times. Officer Martinez stepped closer under the pretense of refilling his plate. He made small talk that none of us needed. His real job, the part of the evening that felt like a cold engine, was happening somewhere else. 2 unmarked cars in a strip of shadow, officers watching for the signal to move. That planning breath of police work felt like a promise and like a postponement. Linda's phone buzzed. She checked it and paled ever so slightly. She excused herself and walked toward the ladies' room. Paul followed, his hand hovering near his coat pocket, the same pocket where, a week earlier, Jason had found a stack of pre-signed documents and a notarized look-alike that didn't match Mom's handwriting when he compared it to a birthday card. I hadn't wanted to know what that meant. Knowing was a tool in the hand of someone sharpened on necessity. I could talk to Linda, I thought. Part of me wanted to say, "What the hell are you doing?" And part of me, an old habit, wanted to arrange cushions around her so she could confess and be forgiven. The voice of practicality and the voice of righteous anger argue with each other in families like ours. Often they reach a stalemate, and the one that survives is the one that refuses to speak. Jason squeezed my finger under the table like he did when he wanted to promise that he had a plan. He caught my eye, and the ghost of a child who used to hide behind my skirts in church flashed across his face with something else, an armor that had belonged to him for months. He had been pacing these scenes in his head for a long time. He had thought that if he could only collect enough, he could move the world to a place where safety was a fact, not a hope. When Linda and Paul returned, Linda brought with her a small wrapped box. It was a present for Mom, the sort of triviality that makes a party whole. She pressed it into Mom's hands with a flourish, and then, like any attentive sister-in-law, asked Mom if she was ready for the cake. "Not yet," Mom said, and reached for the box. "Well, let's open it now," she added, her voice bright. We clustered around her and made the moment small and lovely. Inside the box was a scarf, pale blue, exactly the color Mom liked. She kissed Linda on the cheek in the way that family does when it wants to make things matter. The photograph moment, the paper crown someone made for her head. It should have been a simple memory we could fold into an album and close. But the tape in my son's phone sat like a splinter in my hand. I felt it under my skin. The thing that made me most angry about the recording was not that my sister could betray us. That, horrible as it is, people betray each other all the time. But the mechanical way she had talked about Mom, as if Mom were a problem to be solved instead of a human being who had a right to every small dignity. She had said, "We can't leave it to chance," the recording had said. It had been so calm. That calm scared me more than a scream. We returned to the table and tried to imagine normal. My thoughts kept splitting like wood. One line was white hot with plans for elimination. Get Mom's keys, take her bank cards, change her locks. The other line was quieter. I must not let my panic be exploited as proof of my sister's accusations. Any rash move could be spun. We needed police to see what we saw, not just what we said. Officer Martinez slipped a note under the table toward Jason. On it, a number and a single instruction. Maintain observation. Signal if Linda leaves with Mom. The word signal was elegantly empty. How do you signal against the plan of 2 people who had rehearsed? How do you tell an officer in a room full of people that the person 2 chairs over intends to replace your mother's agency with a document? People talk in celebrations about the future as if it is gentle and predictable. I remembered thinking, as a child, that the future was just another room you keep entering. The adult version of that naivety is imagining your family will always be on your side. It's a luxury. It is not necessary. That realization arrived like a cold rain. At some point during the second glass of champagne, a power flickered through the building. For a blessed instant, everyone laughed. "Typical," someone said. The string quartet made the best of the pause and turned it into a louder chord that covered the murmurs. Electrical blinks are common. In older buildings, they tell you more about wiring than anything else. Still, my gut tightened. Jason's finger found my wrist under the table like a compass needle. "Don't look," he mouthed. "Don't give them the look." Linda stood and offered to lead a short prayer before cutting the cake, the kind of small theatrical piety that smoothed over nothing and everything. She clicked through her phone, and a warm, practiced tone filled the room. People bowed their heads. Mom's eyes closed. Linda's placed near Mom's ear like a small, careful hand. I watched Linda's face. Her expression had the practiced softness of someone who believes that appearances will keep their true actions shielded. Paul lingered near the kitchen, dipping his hands into the cold of pots and making small jokes to men who liked to be bossed. Dr. Peterson smiled so that he looked like an old friend. Each of them in the context of a room full of people became ordinary. And ordinariness is a dangerous sort of camouflage. Near the cake table, a server tripped and a lamp clattered. The lights shuddered, and then, this I remember exactly, the room went dark. Real dark. Not the polite dimming of a candlelit wish, but the kind of darkness that has weight. For a moment nobody moved. Then someone screamed because of how startling it was. The string quartet's players strained to find the next chord and failed. Glass tinkled. A child's voice broke into a sharp "Mom!" under the shroud. Jason's hand found the phone like a talisman of the modern world. He flicked it on. The screen was a clean point of light in a room that had lost everything else. At first I thought it was an accident. Older buildings, older systems, they trip and catch. But the way the dark arrived felt exact, as if someone had taken a blanket and pulled it over us. The hush that followed was the loudest sound of all. As the room murmured and people reached for candles and phones, I felt my son press close. He whispered, "Don't move. Wait for them to come." His eyes flashed something like steel, part fear, part readiness. I understood in a way that was not about the party anymore, but about a ledger of betrayals. The recording had done more than reveal an intent. The recording had set us standing on a threshold. From my place in the dark, I could sense Linda moving, tall in the shadow, and Paul close behind her, the way vultures have a coordinated glide. Dr. Peterson's hand touched Mom's elbow with a tenderness that did not belong in the dark. The world narrowed to a breath. I should have screamed. It is one of those things that 1,000 movies tell you to do. Instead, what I did was the quieter violence. I reached, fingers fumbling, and found Mom's hand. My fingers closed on something that was not as fragile as I had supposed. There was an instant in which everything in me wanted to push back with a force born of calamity, but the dispatcher had said, "Do not intervene." The police had told us to let them watch. That instruction rang like duty and like cowardice at the same time. But I thought of the camera icon on my son's phone, the recording that had done more than any shout could have done. I thought of the small, prudent acts that would make the police's job simple. I thought of how, if we scrambled and created a scene, any medical claims could be twisted into evidence of dementia or paranoia. And then, right on the edge of instinct, a new sound cut through the darkness, a low electronic hum, someone's radio, then a voice I recognized because I had been speaking with him earlier. Officer Martinez, steady, close. "Police," he said in a soft, controlled way. "Please remain where you are." The tone of his voice told us he was part way through a plan, and that someone else had moved faster than we expected. The lights flickered back on slowly, as if someone had tested the room's reaction to exposure. Faces, once softened by shadow, came into an ugly clarity. Linda's smile in the light was a little more brittle than before. Paul was trying to look casual, but had the red flush of someone who had been startled. Dr. Peterson's composure had a hairline crack. Officer Martinez moved with others then, people who had been watching, pressing closer with authority instead of pretense. Police in plain clothes became a presence, a kind of steady gravity that made certain actions impossible. They asked Linda to stay near the stage. They asked Paul to put his hands where they could see them. They spoke to Dr. Peterson, their questions clipped but not unkind. The officers sounded like people who had to make moral calculations without drama. The first real evidence came in small, practical things. A folded envelope in Paul's coat pocket with what appeared to be a notary stamp. A stack of documents with the same signature that did not match the one on Mom's checks. A padded folder in Linda's purse with printed forms and what looked like bank notices. The officers didn't make dramatic declarations. They did what police do best: collect, catalog, and make the world reducible to pieces of paper that can be examined. I stood there like someone looking at my own life through a camera lens. The prosecution of a private life is an odd experience, clinical, precise, and somehow more devastating than a shout. As papers were examined and phones turned over, and names exchanged in the way that cops do when they are moving from observation to action, I realized how close we'd been to losing the small freedom someone had the power to sign away. Linda's face crumpled at some point. It wasn't a stage crumble. It was the real damage of someone suddenly encountering a ledger marked with their own crimes. Paul tried to explain. He said, "We only wanted..." And then he stopped because "we only wanted" is a sentence people use when the only honest end is apology. I remember very plainly that the room smelled like cake and antiseptic and fear. Mom sat silent for a minute, as if trying to decide which of the versions of her life were true. She had been a woman who'd taught Sunday school, who'd sung soprano in choirs and made a small garden look like a cathedral. In that moment, she looked like a person who had been used as a hinge. The whole family had swung on her. Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived a little later, after the initial constellations of evidence had been gathered. She had a presence that did not demand attention, but shaped it anyway. Her questions were simple and exact. She asked Jason about the recording, about where and when he'd gotten it. She spoke with the quiet of someone who'd seen this script before and wanted to make sure she had the pages in the right order. Jason told her what he could, which was as much as a man who loves his grandmother and fears for her life can say. He had leaned on technology in a way that felt like a small rebellion against the way the world privileges louder voices. He had recorded a conversation that would have been invisible if he'd not been listening. He showed her timestamps, a clipped excerpt, the kind of evidence that loses none of the human cruelty when you watch it with your eyes open. "We're going to make sure she has support," Detective Rodriguez said. "For now, we need statements from everyone. We need to secure the documents and interview witnesses. You did the right thing calling us." You try to measure what the right thing means after the fact. Did it mean calling the police and letting them watch and risk the nightmare of being told not to intervene? Did it mean trusting the legal system in a moment that felt urgent and intimate? Sometimes the right thing is the thing that is least dramatic but most durable. Call professionals, gather facts. Don't play into the hands of people who plan concerts of chaos for their own profit. They led Linda and Paul, after some firmness and a few rights advisories, toward a security office in the back of the center, where the lights hummed the gentlest. They did not make accusations in public. Detective Rodriguez preferred the quiet that comes with procedure. They took statements. Friends stood in the doorway, blotting their eyes the way people do when they attempt to count their losses. Mom sat in a folding chair near the cake table, as if the room could be folded up like a map she no longer needed. She let the scarf from her gift fall onto her lap. She held it there like a talisman or a question. Her hands were a landscape I had always known. Now they seemed like a cartography of everything I feared losing. autonomy, agency, the right to decide small things like the color of a scarf or the coarseness of tea. Later, Detective Rodriguez would say things about patterns and about how people who profit from elder vulnerabilities tend to work in quiet, in layers, enlisting family members when possible and professional faces when necessary. She used words like conspiracy and forgery and exploitation, but always with the caution of someone who knows that accusations must be built into proofs before they are allowed to bruise reputations. She noted that names had been repeated on several documents, and the notary marks looked manufactured, and she asked for more time for her team to comb these details. That was comforting in the practical sense, and not comforting in the emotional one. Justice takes time, and time is what predators try to buy. After everyone had been spoken to and the officers had taken the papers away in marked evidence bags, the room emptied. The band played a slow, tonal thing to fill the gap that we didn't yet have words for. People hugged in awkward stations like ships in fog. I remember vividly feeling a strange reverence for the small domesticities that returned. Someone laying a napkin on a cake plate again, someone folding a program into the inside of a pocket. Outside, in the dark that had become almost ordinary, Jason and I sat in the car for a long time. He started the engine merely so the radio would make a small blanket of sound, and we would not have to conjure silence between us. He handed me his phone and the recording again, like an offering that had turned everything else into a task list. "We don't have all of it yet," he said, "but it's enough." "You did good," I said, though the words felt insufficient. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He is a man who keeps his sorrow like a folded map. Tight corners, neat edges. "We did good," he said. "We kept her." We drove Mom home that night in a car that feels longer than it used to. She hummed softly under her breath to a tune I could not name. She seemed, to her credit, to be small and irrepressibly herself, as if some essential weather of her could not be touched. Sometimes in the back seat, we spoke of banal things, bridge nights, the new bulbs for the porch light, in the soft voices of people who are trying to piece life back together from the seams. Sleep didn't take me easily that night. I thought about how small acts, recording a conversation, refusing a cup of tea, had done more than any of us had expected. I thought about how thin the line is between help and harm when family members step into financial roles. I thought of how much the world assumes a silence will save a family, not noticing that silence can be sold. Before dawn, when the house was entirely still, I sat with a cup of coffee and rehearsed what I would say the next day if I had to explain to Mom, in plain language, what had happened. Language becomes a miracle when it has to hold truth without cruel edges. It must be precise, but humane. I thought about Linda and the sermons she'd preached on Sundays, about the dinners she'd hosted where she had once been the hostess, with the regrets I had always excused. She was more than a villain. She was somebody we had loved badly and perhaps been loved badly by. That does not excuse the evidence, but it complicates the story. And human stories are almost always complicated. As the first light broke, I made a half-decision that would have to become whole in the days ahead. I would go through Mom's papers with Jason. I would get copies of everything. I would make sure Mom had legal representation she chose, not the kind that arrived with a smiling envelope. I would listen to all of the recordings Jason had. I would be ready to answer any questions Detective Rodriguez might have. It was not, I told myself, a plan of crusade so much as a scaffolding, strong enough to hold whatever weight might appear. If this is speaking to you, drop your city in the comments and subscribe for more real-life stories like this. The way these things unfold is never tidy. The night gave us a reprieve and a new kind of fear. Detective Rodriguez told us that sometimes the first sweep uncovers a broader current. Documents lead to notaries, notaries to firms, firms to names. People like to move in networks, she said, with an accent of sorrow. She mentioned in a way that was almost casual and therefore chilling that her team had seen similar tactics before, and that occasionally they connected to people who trafficked in family asset protection schemes. When I asked what that meant, she showed me a file packet and said, "We can't talk about all the details yet, but follow the paper trail. Names repeat, patterns emerge. Keep Mom close." We kept her close. We started the long, delicate business of reclaiming agency, of disentangling a person from a plan made by other hands. We began with paper, bank statements, power of attorney forms, a set of signatures that didn't match. We photographed everything. We cataloged dates and places. Jason, who had started this with a single recording, became the archivist and the angriest quiet in the house. I want to be fair about Linda. I want to affirm that people are never entirely flat. When Detective Rodriguez asked Linda to come in for a statement the next morning, Linda's eyes had a look I recognized from my own life, puffed and near inconsolable, but also sly with the last vestiges of performance. She said things that could have been true and things that didn't stand up under the light. At one point she said, "We were helping her. Was that so wrong?" And I realized how easy it is to rearrange words when you have already rearranged the ledger of someone's life. What worried me most wasn't just the immediate threat to Mom's house or freedom. It was the architecture of how someone like Linda could persuade herself to cross moral lines. How do you come to believe your actions are generosity when they are calculations? I remembered things tied to years. Early requests for money paid, back late or not at all. Small lies that had become the basis for larger ones. A childhood of favors being tallied like accounts. Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones who have been given your trust the longest. Weeks fold into strange shapes when you are living inside a case. There are practicalities. A lawyer's office that smells of lemon oil and coffee breath. A detective who asks for call logs. A bank clerk who explains foreclosure timelines in a manner devoid of mercy. There are things that small talk cannot touch. The moments when Mom's memory stutters and when she wakes from a nap with an urgent question about whether we had eaten. There are times when she turns to me and says, "What did Linda mean about the house?" And my stomach drops like a dropped thing that will not stop falling. We learned as the days went on that the recording was not the only thing. Jason found more, a photocopy that looked like a legal form, but with a signature that wasn't Mom's, a receipt for an evaluation at a clinic that Mom never attended, an emailed note from a name later identified as associated with a larger operation, Marcus Webb. The name came to us like something in a long string of possible horrors. Detective Rodriguez, with that same tightness of procedure, said she had seen the name before in other investigations, and that it suggested a structure that bought favors, placed professionals, and smoothed outcomes for people who wanted to turn elder assets into liquid goods. Marcus Webb's name meant nothing alone. Attached to documents, it became a hint of a network. We kept finding threads, a notary 2 towns over, a certificate of guardianship filed under a slightly altered version of Mom's legal name. Each discovery felt like stepping on someone's loose floorboard and watching dust come up. We never let Mom be interviewed alone now. I watched the way she leaned on familiarity, on me, on Jason, and how even the safety of family can be complicated when family is involved in harm. Part of my grief was for the way someone who deserves control is stripped of it not just by crime, but by the soft erosion of being told what she should want. That erosion is harder to spot than a broken window or a forged signature because it comes from a voice you trusted at family dinners. Detective Rodriguez was methodical. She arranged for a quick lab test on the tea in the cup Jason had intercepted. The police had care of the cup and the contents. The lab would tell if anything was wrong. The result, she said, could not be shared casually while proceedings were ongoing. According to the lab, she said, there is an indication of a sedative in the sample. But then her voice grew careful. We need to be precise with public statements. For now, this helps justify the search warrants we want to pursue. The words sounded small when she spoke them, but in their reserve there was a quiet thunder, evidence that could turn suspicion into charges. But it could also turn into the kind of legal tangle that takes years to unravel. I thought of the way justice is slow and how that slow feels like a leaving. At home, we began to gather stories. Friends and neighbors who had seen Linda at other times remarked on similar, helpful interventions. A suggestion to move a mother into a certain facility, a recommendation for a doctor who wrote quickly and signed quicker. One by one we put names next to dates, and sometimes the names matched the fabric of the broader pattern Detective Rodriguez suspected. We began to see that if this was a pattern, it wasn't limited to our family. It bled into other houses, other lives. There were phone calls in the night. A woman named Margaret Foster left a message on our home line because she'd seen an old post about suspicious guardianship practices. A man named James Chen emailed, saying that his aunt had been moved after a week of consultations. An elderly woman named Eleanor Patterson left a trembling voicemail saying simply, "They took my papers. I can't find them." Detective Rodriguez told us to treat these leads carefully. She set up a time to meet people who might be credible witnesses. The more we looked, the less accidental it felt. Papers had been assembled like a machine, convincing not because each part was perfect, but because the collection of small imperfections made a convincing whole. Someone like Marcus Webb, she suggested, didn't need to be in the room to steer events. He could have been a name on stationery, a solicitor in a suit, a broker of convenience. That network, if it existed, showed a comfort with exploiting the small inefficiencies of the system. A bank that doesn't check signatures closely, a notary who is too eager, a lawyer who prefers expedience to scrutiny. It is easy to become monocular in these investigations, to see enemies everywhere. Detective Rodriguez asked me repeatedly to keep an even view. "We need facts," she would say. "We can't let anger make the evidence." I wanted to tell her that anger was what got me out of bed some mornings. That anger is the only thing that anger is what kept me moving forward. It let me sort papers at 2 in the morning. It let me sit through depositions and listen without collapsing. It made me call strangers and ask them to tell their stories into notes that would later become evidence. It kept our household from dissolving into that softer, deadlier thing, denial. The weeks that followed were full of small, deliberate motions. Detective Rodriguez's team worked with a kind of patience I had not known possible. Meticulous, sometimes maddening, often miraculous in the way they coaxed truth into the open. Warrants were drafted. Bank accounts were frozen. Forensic teams checked notaries and signatures. Jason and I sat in a tiny conference room and watched copied stacks of paper become maps. We learned what to look for. Repeated stamps from the same notary, a clerk's handwriting that was just a little too consistent, invoices for consultation meetings that matched the weeks someone had suddenly suggested a move. Marcus Webb's name began to show up with the stubbornness of a bruise you find days after you hit your knee. There were old web pages, slick, reassuring copy about family asset protection, and faded testimonials that had a glossy, persuasive tone. There were forums where people praised the ease with which guardianship had been arranged. There was a photograph of Marcus, a businessman in a gray suit smiling in front of a tasteful office. And the way the image was catalogued made his operation look like any other service. Respectable, bureaucratic, necessary. That was the whole trick. Predation dressed itself as assistance. Detective Rodriguez arranged for us to meet some of the other families. She thought it was important that we see the human scale of what this network left behind. The first visit was to Margaret Foster, who lived in a tidy apartment that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon oil. Margaret had been moved, Linda told us later, on the pretext of a medical evaluation. She was 79, once a music teacher, and stubborn like a thistle. She kept sheet music in a drawer and hummed without realizing it. When we arrived, Margaret opened her door slowly, as if the thought of new faces required a small bravery she had had to put on that day. "They told me they were helping me get more help," Margaret said, her voice a small, brave strip of sound. "They said they'd make my bills easier. Next thing I knew, the papers were signed and I couldn't get them back." Her hands were steady as she held our folder, the copy of the signature we had taken from a tea receipt. "I didn't sign that," she said, and there was a kind of aching resignation in the words. "I don't write like that." We sat on her couch, and she told us about a man who had a way of calling people darling and of making small, crucial appointments. She didn't like the word guardian. It felt like the opposite of what she had been all her life. Jason and I listened and documented, and Detective Rodriguez took notes with a professional gentleness that somehow made Margaret feel like the center of her own story again. James Chen's story came next. James was the nephew of a woman who had taken his aunt to what she thought was a geriatric clinic. Instead, she found a new address and a pile of legal forms she didn't recall signing. James had a methodical way of telling the story. Dates, times, receipts. He had been to the bank, to the clinic, to a notary who kept shifting locations. "It was all very fast," he said. "They made it sound like paperwork that had to be done immediately." "My aunt, she's cautious. But they made the right noises and she agreed." Eleanor Patterson was quieter. She had been someone who could match furniture to a poem. Her voice trembled on the edges of sentences, but when she spoke of her independence, there was a brightness that reminded me of Mom humming when she thought no one listened. "They told me they'd streamline my bills so I could go back to painting," she said. "They wanted to help me spend my afternoons doing what I loved. I thought, well, I was lonely. They listened." These were not dramatic confessions of violence. They were small griefs catalogued over time. Phone calls at strange hours, recommendations from smiling professionals, forms signed at the edges of meals. All of it pointed back to a pattern, a network that smoothed the path from help to control with professional faces and handshakes. Detective Rodriguez found enough to move. She obtained search warrants for several addresses connected to Marcus Webb and his associates. She subpoenaed the internal records of some clinics that had been used as part of the chain of recommendations. She worked with handwriting experts who compared our samples to the signatures on the documents and who, with clinical detachment, pointed out anomalies. The experts did not speak in moral language. They spoke in measures and variances. Still, the result felt like a kind of justice, data making a story visible. The lab confirmed what we'd suspected about the tea. The sedative that had been detected in the intercepted cup had matched a compound that could be used in small doses to make an older person drowsy and suggestible. The language Detective Rodriguez used was careful, indication and consistent with and supporting evidence. But to me, it was a sentence. Someone had tried to make Mom incapable of resisting what they had planned. Arrests were made in the slow, procedural way that reality usually operates, less like a movie than like a careful chess game. Paul Barrett was detained at his apartment. Dr. Peterson was picked up on the outskirts of a clinic with a stack of files in his briefcase. Marcus Webb was taken in after officers watched a conference he was attending and moved in when they had enough to show probable cause. Linda was contacted, and that was one of the hardest parts for all of us. She was arrested but soon after spoke with Detective Rodriguez in what would become the first step toward cooperation. Linda's cooperation was complex. She had played a crucial role in making meetings happen. She had phoned people, organized visits, and in some cases, signed forms she should never have touched. But the investigation suggested she had not been the architect of the entire scheme. Marcus Webb's operation had the reach to provide legal templates and the kind of legitimation that made a plan look like help. When Linda realized that the network could be more dangerous than she thought, When she believed she had been asked to do more than she had imagined, she began to talk. She named names. She gave up contacts. She gave us details about meetings in motels and the way paperwork was vetted. She cried a lot, which complicated my anger in a way it deserved. I did not forgive her easily. Forgiveness is not a single act, but a landscape you walk across slowly. I believed still that there was no excuse for taking advantage of the person who had raised you. Yet her testimony became crucial. She described the role Marcus Webb had in promoting himself as a consultant for families who wanted to avoid court complications. A euphemism, Detective Rodriguez said, that in practice meant he brokered placements and wrote letters that were meant to look like neutral evaluations. One of the strangest moments in all of it came during a series of controlled calls Detective Rodriguez arranged. There was a recorded line where a man with a practiced charm, this was not Marcus directly, but one of his regular associates, explained how to smooth a guardianship application for a family. The pitch was clinical. Reduce paperwork, expedite placement, minimize family conflict. The language of convenience. Listening to it felt like overhearing a salesman explain how to sell an old thing as new. It made me, we all, angry in a steadier, more strategic way. The grand jury process dragged on with the inexorable slowness of engines that are grinding towards something inevitable. Papers were reviewed, indictments considered. For days, weeks, I checked my phone for messages from the district attorney's office, as if the device could manifest a verdict. We were told to be patient. I felt impatient as a living thing inside me. Meanwhile, Detective Rodriguez continued to gather evidence. Bank transfers, correspondence, a trail of checks going to people who touted asset protection services on message boards. The first hearing was a public event that felt smaller than I expected. Courtrooms are built to take on the weight of a story without being distracted by the people telling it. We sat in the gallery, and I watched, as if the legal process had its own geography and maps we had to learn to read. We listened to attorneys make arguments about probable cause and evidentiary standards. Linda's counsel spoke on her behalf. The prosecutor spoke of the need to ensure safe guardianship for those who could not advocate for themselves. The word victim was used with a reserved tenderness that made my throat close. The trial, when it finally came, was long. There were technical hearings, arguments about the admissibility of certain recordings, debates over the foundation for handwriting evidence. There were days spent in small rooms with lawyers and legal aides, prepping me and Jason to testify. We went over the sequence of events numerous times, not to rehearse for drama, but to make the memory precise in legal terms. Detective Rodriguez coached us on keeping our answers simple and direct. "Let them ask the complicated questions," she said. "Stick to what you heard and saw." Jason took the stand once to explain the recording. He played the clip in court, and I felt my skin prick as if it were happening again. The room's hum dropped to a reverent silence. People lean in when truth is delivered in audio. Linda's voice, once so domestic in the recording, sounded cold and practical in the courtroom's bright air. The prosecution used the audio to show intent, not proof of the whole operation, but a window into a plotted course. Linda testifying marked the most painful day. She answered questions with laconic honesty that alternated between fierce defense and clear remorse. She described the first time she'd met someone from Marcus Webb's circle at a seminar about protecting family assets. She spoke of being flattered into believing she was doing the right thing, of the allure of being the one who fixed things. She admitted to signing forms and to being part of meetings where professionals suggested lines of action that now looked like snares. When the prosecutor asked why she had decided to cooperate, she said plainly, "Because I finally saw how close I had been to losing my mother." There were cross-examinations that tried to make her look manipulative, but there were also moments when she simply spoke the truth of regret. She described, without theatrical flourish, how it felt to see a woman who had been a teacher reduced to a string of signatures. Her testimony helped the jury understand the structure of the scheme, the way professional faces, doctors, notaries, consultants made a predatory plan seem like efficiency. Dr. Peterson's defense was thin. He argued his role had been that of a physician asked to consult, and that his notes, hastily written in clinic hours, were meant to reflect clinical concern. The prosecution countered with the pattern the document trail revealed. Notes that tended to appear just before certain forms were notarized, clinic invoices that matched the timing of other documents, a pattern that suggested a working relationship rather than isolated acts of medical care. Marcus Webb's defense came with a polished team. They urged the jury to see his operation as a business that offered services families sometimes needed urgently. They argued that families sought him out in a time of stress, that he provided an expedient alternative to a cluttered legal process. The prosecutors countered with dates and phone logs, with receipts for meetings in motels, with affidavits from people who recounted promises and pressures. The evidence the state compiled was not a single smoking gun. It was a web of small, consistent practices, forms, signatures, notary stamps, that painted a picture of an enterprise built on exploiting gaps. What mattered in the end were the people. The jury heard testimony from Margaret, who described waking up in a new room and realizing she had no keys. They heard James describe the way his aunt's mail had been routed. They heard Eleanor talk about the paintings she could not access. They heard Mom. She decided to go to the courthouse and deliver a victim impact statement, even though it had been suggested she might avoid the formalities. She wanted to say something that would make it clear she was still herself. Standing before the courtroom's bench, Mom's voice shook once and then steadied. "They tried to make choices for me," she said, looking toward the defendants with a kind of tired good sense. "They told me my life was easier if I let them. I don't like being told what to do. But I also forgive the people who made mistakes, because I know how easy it is to make them. I'm here because I want to help everyone who has been told their small decisions no longer matter." Her words were concise and not theatrical. They had the power of someone who had lived fully and was now trying to translate that life into a language the courtroom could understand. Dignity, not just facts. The room absorbed it like a necessary truce. When the verdicts came, there was a hush in my chest, like the moment before a tide comes in. The jury found Marcus Webb guilty on several counts: conspiracy, fraud, exploitation. The language of the verdict felt legal, but what mattered was that a person who orchestrated a network that targeted elders had been held accountable. Marcus was sentenced. The judge imposed penalties that aimed to reflect the harm done. Dr. Peterson and Paul pleaded guilty to charges related to the scheme. Some received sentences and some received probation, depending on their involvement and cooperation. Linda received a reduced sentence in exchange for her testimony and for the key details she provided that helped other investigations proceed. The legal system rarely offers neat closure, but in that moment there was a sense of a balance being restored. I cannot pretend the courtroom brought catharsis in a vacuum. There were practical concerns immediately after: asset recovery processes, contested wills, a bank that required signatures to be redone and that moved with the cautious pace of bureaucracy. But there was also a profound sense that naming a harm and holding those responsible to account created a public record that could not be erased by charm or convenience. One of the most meaningful outcomes was the ripple effect Detective Rodriguez had anticipated. The trials prompted other investigators to look into similar operations. Our family's case became part of a larger portfolio that exposed how asset protection schemes operate in several regions. More victims came forward. Margaret, James, and Eleanor were not isolated stories anymore. They were evidence that a pattern existed, We spent months visiting nursing homes and facilities, documenting conditions and speaking with administrators who would sometimes be defensive and other times unexpectedly helpful. In a few cases, residents had been placed in facilities that were ill-suited to their needs. In others, families had been encouraged to sign forms without full explanation. We learned about the underfunded landscapes that make elders vulnerable, the understaffed clinics, the understaffed legal aid offices, the loneliness that drives people to accept help from strangers who sound certain. Gradually, the family settled into a new rhythm. Mom sold the house she had lived in for 40 years. We agonized over the decision. Selling the place where Mom had raised us, where she had painted Virginia creeper across the front porch. I still feel a pinch when I think of the boxes and the way the porch light looked the last night it was ours, was an ending and a new beginning. We used a portion of the proceeds to support a small advocacy initiative, a fund to help elders get independent legal advice, and to support neighbor check programs that taught families the basics of financial safeguarding. Mom insisted on giving a portion as a donation for legal aid clinics that could help people who couldn't pay for counsel. She changed slowly into an advocate the way seasons change, not in a dramatic bloom, but in quiet, relentless accumulation. She started by speaking at a small meeting of caregivers in the county library. She told her story plainly, not victim drama, but the pragmatic account of how she had been approached and how she had been treated. People listened, some cried, some took her hand afterward. She became a point of contact for elders who would call her and leave messages about suspicious calls or about strangers offering to sort things out for a fee. Jason made a different choice for his life. He enrolled in classes focused on elder law and advocacy, a path that felt like the long arc of the recording he had made, small acts of prevention preventing larger swindles. He studied how guardianship statutes could be exploited and how counseling and legal representation could create bulwarks against manipulation. He did not want to be just reactive. He wanted a practice that would help people before predators had a chance to speak. I found myself back in rooms I used to avoid, board meetings at community centers, state task force, panels talking about elder exploitation. I still hated the spotlight, but I could not deny its usefulness. When people asked, "How did you know?" I would say, "We listened to a voice that didn't want to be quieted." I learned to speak in policy terms, training for bank employees to spot suspicious activity, mandatory waiting periods on certain types of guardianship requests, better oversight for consultants who offered to solve family conflicts. There were legal reforms proposed in our county. Some of them were modest: clearer notary checks, mandatory phone calls to primary contacts before a guardianship application could become final, better public awareness campaigns. I am not a policymaker, and I spent plenty of nights thinking about the limits of individual action. But the small legislative changes that came about felt like something tangible we had done, less like revenge and more like prevention. Linda's path after sentencing was complicated. The criminal record and the truth of what she'd done did not evaporate. She spent some time in a program that included counseling and restitution work. She met with victims and, where appropriate, apologized in private. The family did not magically reknit itself. Some members could not accept her back into the rhythm of holidays and phone calls. Others moved slowly toward a kind of guarded forgiveness that was more about accepting complexity than about absolution. One thing that surprised me in the aftermath was how often people reached out simply to say, "Thank you." Strangers wrote notes about how our case had made them check their parents' paperwork. A woman from another state called to tell me she had reclaimed her father's power of attorney after hearing a podcast about our story. Those messages felt like a ledger of small changes that were, in the aggregate, life-saving. There were days when I still sat in the car outside a grocery store and felt as if by habit the weight of a locked door. The night Jason locked the car did not become less significant. Instead, it became a reference point, a small bright sign in memory that marked when things shifted. He had pressed a button, and in doing so, had created a moment that multiplied. He had given us an opening that no one else could have given. His recording was the seed that the investigators watered. We continued to do outreach, talks at senior centers, interviews with journalists who asked questions that sometimes felt invasive and other times necessary. Mom spoke at one panel, and I watched her from a corner of the room, thinking about the woman who had taught me about chords and about kindness. She had a quiet power now, the sort of thing that persuades strangers more than it commands them. She spoke not of legalities, but of rights, the right to be consulted, the right to refuse, the right to live small indignities on one's own terms. There were still moments of fear. A bank clerk once asked to see Mom's ID in a way that made me tense. A paperwork glitch required a call to the attorney who had helped us. But those were the small frictions of a life under reconstruction, not the battering assaults that had preceded our discovery. We learned to be vigilant in a way that did not become paranoia. Part of the family work, perhaps the hardest part, was rebuilding trust in a way that allowed us to keep our humanity intact. It's easy to demonize and to be satisfied with a simple narrative where all is darkness or light. The more honest work was learning how to hold contradiction. A sister who had done harm and who also had been cared for. A mother who had both been vulnerable and resilient. A son whose technological skill had saved a life and who also needed to learn how to rest. Months later, at an event for elder rights, Mom took the microphone again and told a room full of people something she had learned. "Nobody gets to decide how your life will be lived without asking you," she said. "And when they try, you can ask for help." She winked, the same little mischief she'd always had, and people laughed and then listened. She had become, in a way we never expected, a steward of other people's dignity. There were quieter, private moments that held the biggest weight for me. One afternoon, Mom and I sat in the garden with a cup of coffee and a small stack of seed catalogs. She pointed at a picture of a plant and said, "I think I want to try something new this year." The ordinariness of that line was everything. It meant the world in its smallness. I realized that justice, for us, was not only in the courtroom or in Marcus Webb's conviction. It was also in afternoons where a woman could choose what to plant. We never stopped watching for signs. Detective Rodriguez's team kept in touch with us until their docket closed. Even now, we get follow-up letters indicating other investigations opened because of the evidence we helped provide. Some of those investigations led to charges in other counties. Some were resolved with civil settlements, which returned a small measure of money and a larger measure of accountability. It wasn't enough to undo everything, but it changed the calculus for those who would prey on elders in the future. The family that had gathered in that community center the day of Mom's 85th birthday did not remain the same configuration. Some relationships mended, others ended. There were Thanksgiving tables that never quite matched the old pattern. There were, however, also new gatherings, support groups and advocacy meetings where survivors and families came together, not to narrate only pain, but to build strategies. Mom became a member of such groups, and sometimes she would come home and tell me about a woman who had been talked into a guardianship or an older man who had been coaxed to sign over his house. "We have to be louder," she would say, "and also kinder. There is a peculiar cruelty in predation that insists it is kindness. The antidote, as we discovered, is a kindness that listens. If there's a moral to be drawn from this long, painful stretch, it's that vigilance without compassion hardens into suspicion, and compassion without vigilance dissolves into trust given too easily. The work of protection is to do both, be alert and be loving." Jason, having started his coursework, volunteered at a legal clinic once a week. He helped people fill out forms, explained in plain language what a power of attorney could mean, and sometimes sat with elders while they called a child who had been out of the picture. He had a way of translating technological details into human terms. It's not about scaring people, he told me once. It's about giving them tools to make choices. At the 10-month mark, we held a small gathering for Mom's 90th, because time has a way of pushing us forward, whether we are ready or not. We invited Margaret, James, and Eleanor. We set up tables in the same community center, and we were careful about who sat where. We were also determined not to let fear run the seating chart. People laughed with a certain guarded joy. Mom wore a blue scarf and looked like someone who understood how to make a room feel like home. We made a small presentation for the advocacy fund and showed a little slide with the names of the volunteers who had helped. No one made grand speeches. We ate cake, and the music was just loud enough to carry away the edges of the past. Sometimes people ask me if the pain ever goes away. It doesn't, not in the way you might imagine. There are days when the memory of the recording lifts like a fog, and there are other days when it sits on the shoulder like a reminder. But the weight of action, of having done something meaningful with the discovery, lightens it. There is a stubborn pleasure in knowing that a locked car and a pressed button can create a chain reaction of protection. Who would have thought a single moment of refusal, locking the door, playing a recording, could be the hinge on which a family's safety turned? If you have learned anything from our story, let it be this: small acts matter. A neighbor's curiosity can save a life. A recording can be evidence. A child's insistence can be the difference between loss and preservation. Speak up when things feel off. Gather documents. Don't let apologies for help substitute for scrutiny. And remember, dignity is not a commodity to be sold. It's an inheritance to be respected. We are careful now, but not afraid. We live with more clarity about who we are. A family that has been betrayed, yes, but also one that has chosen to fight back in ways both legal and tender. We support other families. We advocate for policies that protect elders. Mom tends her garden. Jason studies law. Linda writes letters to people about what she learned privately and seeks to do some restitution where possible. None of us are the same as we were, and that is perhaps the best truth I can offer. If you're sitting with a similar suspicion, if small things have made you wonder, tell someone. Get a copy of documents. Ask for help. Call your local adult protective services or legal aid clinic and ask what options exist. Talk to a trusted friend and write down dates and names. It sounds pedestrian, but paper combined with voices is what dismantled the scheme that almost took my mother's freedom. If this resonates with you, share your experience with someone you trust or with an advocacy group. Tell your city in the comments. If you think someone you know might be at risk, encourage them to seek independent legal advice and to keep a trusted contact in the loop. There are hotlines and legal clinics that provide guidance. Look for elder rights organizations, local adult protective services, or pro bono legal aid in your area. You don't have to go through this alone. The locked car remains, in my memory, a small cathedral of a moment, private, decisive, a place where an ordinary action became the hinge of a larger justice. My son pressed the lock and in doing so made the choice that set everything else in motion. That choice taught us that sometimes family protection looks like patience, sometimes like confrontation, and sometimes like an insistence to let professionals do their work. Mostly it taught us that dignity can be reclaimed one careful step at a time.